Hi, good afternoon. I'm Francisco Castillo, or simply Kiko. I'm the CIO of Maynilad Water, and today I'll be sharing something which I think is relevant to each one of us. It's with regards to patching. And the title is Patching, Everybody Does It, Then Why Does It Fail? So I'm going to try to address some of the challenges that we encounter with patching. So firstly, a few words about my company, Maynilad Water. Secondly, although it may seem obvious, why patch? Some of the challenges in patching. I'll share with you a real-life example and end with some takeaway conclusion. So Maynilad Water is the water company in the west zone of Metro Manila and Cavite, serving 9 million people. We're the largest private water concessionaire in the Philippines. And aside from water, we also provide septage and sewerage service to 17 cities and municipalities in Metro Manila and Cavite. With regards to my particular role, one of the main concerns as a IT and security professional is patching. And the reason for that is patching is actually very important. Just to share, this is a report by the Australian Government Department of Defense. I would recommend that you take a look at this because it's written in a very practical way, and it lists in priority the mitigation actions that one can take to avoid any hacking incidences. And always in the top three every year is patching, right? So it's identified as really a top mitigator. Furthermore, patches on the other side of the wall are are a good source of information to hackers. When a new patch is released, hackers take a look at it, reverse engineer, and look at what specific aspects this patch addresses, what vulnerabilities they address, so that they can take advantage and attack before companies patch. So in effect, you're really at risk within a couple of days. So that means you really need to patch ASAP. The fact is, if I ask anyone here who patches, I'd probably see the majority of hands raised. But if we are patching, then why does it fail, right? Not only Philippine companies, but take a look at these excerpts from the media. They're all hacks into big companies, right? And all of them have happened due to unpatched applications. The reality is that although patching is really needed, there are real challenges to patching. So what are those challenges? Let's go one by one. The first challenge is that if you're doing patching manually, this means that you're practically taking a long time to patch, right? Patches are applied ad hoc. They usually go through a long approval process. They take too long and not comprehensive. By the time you started patching, there's probably a new patch that you have to apply. So, in effect, you're not up to date, right? The solution to this is to use automatic patching solutions available in the market. Patches also impact applications. That means that probably applying that patch may impede the application from working correctly, right? So of course, the natural tendency would be to test that application after you patch. However, because of the large number of applications that you need to patch, the large number of servers, this may be impractical. So yes, test whenever necessary, but if you can't test everything, then have a rollback procedure so that you can restore from the previous state of the application before you patch. This could be as simple as doing a backup and restore. The third challenge is that patching policy. Policy can be thought of as a high-level document where it tells you what are the things you have to do. But for me, it needs to be a very practical document. It needs to tell you what types of patches you have to apply, what servers and endpoints to apply them to, how often, when do you need to do testing, what is the rollback procedure, does this really need approval and from whom? And the most important part is that it cannot be just a piece of paper. You actually need to execute what is written in it, right? So, my recommendation, make a policy. The difficult part with the policy is that you need to get a buy-in and a sign-off from the different departments involved. If you are going to cause downtime because of patching, operations would not like it, but they need to understand that you need that downtime in order to apply the patch, right? So, policy forces you to talk to the different stakeholders and get a sign-off. And of course, again, execute that piece of paper. The challenge number 4 is you may actually not know what to patch. Now, this seems a little bit improbable, but firstly, we have a lot of assets, a lot of servers, a lot of applications, right? And even though you may have identified those applications, right, some of the software components reside very deep into the hardware or the software. You may not even be aware that they exist. So you need to discover them. One way to discover them is through commissioning someone to do a pen test, whether internal or external or both, wherein you actually can expose and discover all your assets. Another way is also to do an inventory. There's ways of doing this automatically. You have automated tools that scan and identify all the components that are in your environment. Recently, we've seen an explosion of what we call IoT, Internet of Things, as well as the traditional industrial devices. And traditionally, both of these are not have not been designed really to be patched. And before we relied on air gaps to isolate the two, but now there is really a very tight integration between IT and OT as well as IoT. So patching actually is something relatively new to these guys, the people running the plants. There are cases where plants running systems have not been patched for years, right? And yet, these systems are critical. They're critical infrastructure that drive machines, drive motors, etc., etc. So the same thing applies. You need also to patch these industrial devices, right? So in the same way as IT, you need to develop a patching policy which defines what you need to do and how often, and again, patch automatically because it's probably impractical to do this manually. The pandemic has actually brought up something even more to the forefront, which is that now people work from home. So now your endpoints are outside your intranet, and you may be constrained with regards to connectivity as well as your infrastructure setup as to how to be able to patch remotely, even for people working from home, right? Sometimes it's the bandwidth as well, right? So there are tools available, there's technologies available, VPN, or you can use VDI, right? And again, you can patch remotely even if they're working from home. And then you also need to address the bandwidth issue. Some of the patches, some of the updates require huge amounts of bandwidth. There's no way around it but to provide the necessary bandwidth. A very common challenge that I've seen, even in very big international organizations, is that although the CISO or the IT security head may consciously want to patch, the application owner and operations may not want to. So it becomes a struggle between the two, right? The operations people do not want any downtime, but the CISO is aware that sometimes in order to patch, there is a necessary downtime, right? So it becomes compounded when the IT security head does not even report to the CIO, so that he can't even get the ear of the CIO to convince him. The solution is that someone has to step in really and enforce the policy and get an agreement between all the parties. And again, if you do that in the form of a policy, make sure that that policy is implemented. Once there is a sign-off by the operations people, sorry, we need to patch, and you gave us this window, so that's the way we will proceed. Okay, so given this scenario, right, let me share with you an example in Maynilad Water. Maynilad actually is highly automated. Through the years, we've automated our facilities so much so that today 95% of our plants are automated. When I say plants, I mean water treatment plants, sewage treatment plants, pumping stations, etc. We have more than 200 facilities. And the challenge is that they're dispersed all over the place, right? We use PLCs, DCS, SCADAs in order to control. We have a 24/7 central control room. You can see the image there, right, which facilitates the monitoring and control of all our plant. And we cannot afford downtime. I mean, we cannot afford to say, hey, sorry, but as a water customer, you will not have water in the next 24 hours, right, for the whole Metro Manila. So we need to do this in a seamless way. So how do we do it? Obviously, we need, in some cases, we need to restart workstations. We need to restart servers in order for the patches to take effect. This causes disruption, right? But we need to keep our plants running. And the operator needs to be able to monitor and control what is happening. So what we did is we first attempted to request every time a slot for doing the patching from operations. What happened? They never got back to us. They never told us, okay, you can do it on this day and time. They just wish that we would go away. So we changed strategy and we came up with a policy. We sat down with them and said, look, let's fix a day of the month where you know that these applications, these servers, etc., would be patched. And only if there is really a case where it needs to be delayed, then you can request it. Otherwise, we will proceed. So at first, they were reluctant, but when we tried it on a few pilot facilities, they saw that it worked, right? The key here was not to patch all workstations and servers simultaneously so that you would have some redundancy. While one particular SCADA, for example, workstation was down, right, because it was being patched, they could still manage to control the plant from another workstation. And of course, having standby IT personnel in case there were issues, right? So definitely, we learned from the pilot and we tweaked the policies accordingly until it became seamless. Today, patching is just accepted. It's just a routinary fact and it's no big deal, right? And it's done automatically. And very important, we have a rollback procedure in case something goes wrong. So, what are the takeaways from all this? Firstly, please patch. It's very important. It's not very costly in terms of what you need to do this automatically. It is costly in terms of thinking of how to do it and coming up with a policy. But automatic patching systems nowadays are not expensive. Manual patching is not good enough. By the time you finish, you already have a huge backlog of patches which have not been applied. The greatest challenge is always people. As I said, it takes time to convince. Operations doesn't want any downtime. But you need to get them on board and you need to convince them and get them to agree. And policy defines what you have to do. So once if they sign, right, it's just a matter of execution. And it makes people think of how we can do this really in an effective way. But once you've done it, you'll realize that, hey, there's really no turning back. This is much more efficient than what we previously did. One last word. I'm the author of this book. It's called Managing Information Technology. It was published by Springer, which is a German publisher. And it really talks about the best practices in running an IT organizations that I've learned through the years, through experience, through errors and pains, right? So this is my way to share that experience so that you don't go through the same pains. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much. Maraming salamat po.
All right, so let's start with the middle part of your presentation. You did mention that for the IT team, right? Sometimes they don't know where to start when it comes to patching or what to patch, even if it sounds so simple. Why is it an issue for some companies?
Yeah. Well, let me give you an example. In our company, we have more than 600 virtualized servers. So imagine that. So that's aside from the application. So sometimes there's so much that you don't even know exactly what you have, right? So doing an inventory manually is really very difficult, and surely you're going to miss something, right? And the same thing goes with applications, right? You may have an application, right? But there are components within it, such as Java components or Jenkins or whatever, right? That you may not be fully aware of what's in it. For you, it's like a black box, right? So that's really a challenge. But there are tools nowadays that help you to scan and actually explore and see what is your landscape, right? I mean, some of these tools are even freeware, So I would really encourage, to use this thing.
Cut. What about for IoT or industrial control space? What practical advice do you have in terms of patching these systems?
Well, to start with, they were never designed with that in mind, right? So much so that I think about a year and a half ago, we saw a lot of attacks, for example, originating from CCTV cameras. They were all hacked and they were used as a platform to attack servers, right? So, same philosophy. You need to patch, right? The only difference is that because of the nature of what they do, right? They're usually dispersed, right? And usually the people handling have other requirements versus the traditional IT. So the same thing, I would recommend, come up with a patching policy, sit down with the users and think of what is the best approach to do this, right? Initially, they will not want to patch, right? But when you give them a rundown of the risks, they will be aware that, hey, we need to do something. Otherwise, something bad is going to happen to the company.
Right. Other than patching policy, is there any pieces of advice that you can give to IT security professionals when it comes to, getting approval for patching from these different departments? Considering that you've mentioned also the pros and cons being downtime, obviously. Any helpful pieces of advice for our audience?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a lot of communication and communicating the risks, right? They have to understand that, maybe having a 20-minute downtime every month is much more worth it than having several weeks of downtime of somebody hacking in, right? One exercise that we've done with our Mancom is actually gone through an exercise of having an actual hack in the company and training them on how to respond, right? Because having an incident is nowadays is a question of when, not if. And if you don't prepare for it, right, then you're going to panic when it happens. And it cannot be seen only from a technical point of view. It has to be the management to realize that it's also a communication issue, it's also a regulatory issue, it's also a customer issue, right? So learning how to handle it is also part of it.
Good. Thank you. And also, Kiko, before we conclude the session, in case any of the audience would like to connect with you, would like to network with you, how would they find you? Is the best way through LinkedIn or email?
Well, definitely you can find me through LinkedIn. Francisco Castillo, Maynilad, you can search me and you can add me. I'll be happy to help out if in any way I can.
So the pandemic started, early this year. Lockdown Manila has one of the longest lockdowns this year, you know, so pretty much end of first quarter, we already started working from home. How was the shift been from working at the office to working from home? And how do you, you know, monitor your staff these days, taking into account the heightened risks of working remotely?
Hmm. Well, you know, it happened all very, very fast, I guess, for everyone. Fortunately, we had the infrastructure in place. What really increased was the usage of that infrastructure. But we did have the capacity. But in just 3 days, we had to, you know, enable 2,200 employees to work from home. It happened fast, pretty well from a technical point of view. And I guess people were just forced to learn how to use many of these tools because there was actually no other choice, right? So technically, I think not that difficult. I think really the difficulty is more of having keeping the team spirit alive, keeping the culture alive. You know, some people are alone working from the house, so you know the challenge of keeping your mental health as well, right? So it's a different set of challenges. Um, Initially, everybody wanted to work from home. As things dragged, I think that perspective has sort of mellowed down. I wouldn't say it died, but it mellowed down. Yeah.
It is indeed the new normal. Along the way, are there any significant, you know, lessons, not just for yourself, but perhaps for the team as well, that you didn't realize before the pandemic, but as the months go on, you know, you grow and understand how to combat these new challenges?
Hmm. Well, there were challenges, and one realization is communication is so important. You need to constantly communicate with your team to reach out, you know, to even have moments where you don't talk about work, but just have fun together. You know, that's one. On the positive side, um, we've actually accelerated doing many things remotely, you know, without actually to have to be there physically. So the possibility has always been there, but now we're just really forced against the wall to do it, you know.